And today I am just really, really delighted to have Jared Fishman here. He was sitting in some of these seats when he was a student here at GW Law, graduated, went to do post-conflict work at the State Department, helping post-conflict countries build rule of law, and then very briefly joined U.S. Attorney's Office, and then DOJ as a civil rights attorney, and he led some of America's most complex civil rights prosecutions, securing convictions in high-profile cases involving police misconduct, hate crimes, and human trafficking. And then, as if that were not enough, he saw that there needed to be a lot of change on the ground in the criminal justice system and founded Justice Innovation Lab, and he is running that today. Please give a warm welcome to Jared Fishman.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me in the back? Yeah? All right. All right, so I want to start off by taking a poll. You can sign in by clapping your hands. How many of you want to use your legal career for good, not evil? Give me a round of applause. All right, now, how many of you want to use your legal career to make as much money as you can, regardless of who you have to represent? Give me a round of applause. Appreciate the honesty. I knew there'd be at least one guy. The talk today is mostly for the first group of people, but for you, my friend, in about 10, 20, maybe 30 years from now, when you realize you actually want to be seeking some sort of purpose in your career, you're going to think back to this moment and hopefully still remember a few of the tips that I'm going to give today along the way. I feel quite fortunate in my career because I believe that at least at this current moment, I have achieved the purpose-driven career. What does that mean? It means that you're doing something that you're good at, you're doing what you love, you're doing what the world needs, and you have found someone to pay you for it. That ultimately is the goal. And today I want to talk to you about what I've learned along the way. One thing that you will know is my story is not a roadmap. You cannot do it the way that I did it because many of the paths that I took are no longer available, unfortunately. But I did learn a lot along the way, and I think that is quite applicable to the journeys that are ahead of you, and perhaps may even be more applicable today than it was when I was a law student. I was a rookie prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice when a thin brown folder landed on my desk. That folder contained two items. The first was an autopsy for a man named Henry Glover. His body was found in a burned car behind a levee in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. The second item was an article from an investigative journalist who laid out what little was known about Henry Glover's last day. And though there was so much that was unknown, one thing was clear. Henry Glover had last been seen in the custody of the New Orleans Police Department. The folder landed on my desk because at that time I was a rookie prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division. I was responsible for investigating allegations of police misconduct. Our office was responsible for policing the police. And the allegations going around New Orleans at that time was that police officers had killed Henry Glover and burned his body to cover up the crime. I was sent down to New Orleans to figure out if this was true. I was teamed up with a rookie FBI agent named Ashley Johnson, and we spent 18 months trying to solve the mystery of the fire on the levee. But before I tell you what happened, I want to tell you a little bit how I got there. When I was little, if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have told you I wanted to be a firefighter. How many of you have been asked this question? What do you want to be when you grow up? Raise your hands if you've been asked that question. How many of you have been asked that question recently? How many of you have asked someone else this question recently? This is a terrible question, and I would really like it for people to stop asking this question. As if we only become one thing. As if there is a point when we actually have grown up. I think the question that we should all be asking, and we should be asking ourselves, is, who do you want to be when you grow up? And what do I mean by that? What kind of person do you want to be when you grow up? And I don't think this is a question that we should just be asking young people, because as I have learned at every single stage of my career, I always have had more growing up to do. You see, when I was 3, my house burned down. And if you would have asked me what I wanted to be, I would have told you a firefighter, because the firefighters were the people who came to my house to try to save it. But had you asked me who I wanted to be, perhaps I would have told you, I want to be the kind of person who helps people when they're in trouble. Now, I think if we shift this framing from the what do we want to be to the who do we want to be, it will make the path ahead of you a lot more clear as you get confronted with opportunities, with jobs, with things that you want to do in your life. I want to tell you a little bit about the path that I took along the way. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a homogeneous Jewish community. Virtually everyone I know saw the world in roughly the same way that I did, had a similar perspective on things. These are my grandparents, Grandma Frida and Grandpa Harry. They came to the U.S. in the late 1930s. They fled Europe right before the Nazis destroyed their community. Growing up, the lesson that was imparted to me through my teachers, through my parents, through my community, was rooted in a Jewish concept known as tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. And the concept is simple, that the world is broken and that we all have an obligation to work to try to fix it. Now, I was a bit of an overachiever. Some might even have called me a gunner. You guys still use that in law school? If you are a gunner, raise your hand. There you go. All right, guy in the front row. Welcome. You know, I was a gunner, and so I wanted to go to the most broken places. I went to places destroyed by war, by genocide. And if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have told you I wanted to be an ambassador. But had you asked me who I wanted to be when I grew up, I might have told you I want to be the kind of person who brings people together. The summer of my junior year in college, I started working at a program called Seeds of Peace. Seeds of Peace is a summer camp program that brought together teenagers from countries at war. I'm going to set the scene a little bit. It's the late 90s. I'm in rural Maine, in the woods, by an idyllic lake. The place was similar to many American summer camps. We lived in bunks. We played epic games of capture the flag. We sang songs around the campfire at night. But what differentiated this program from other summer camps is that all of our kids came from places at war, from the Middle East, from the Balkans, from India and Pakistan, from North and South Cyprus. And they would come and they would have a regular camp experience, but for 2 hours every day, we would engage in dialogue about the issues that were at the heart of their respective conflicts, about history, about identity, about power. And the idea was that to engage with each other at a human level, to engage deeply with the challenges that confronted each other, and to come forward with solutions. I used to run the ropes course. This was an activity that I used to run called the 13-legged race. It is a lot like the 3-legged race that perhaps you have done at some point in your life, just with a lot more legs. The idea was, how do we keep moving forward, burdened as we are by our pasts, by our fears, by our traumas? All of these things slow us down, but we always have to move forward. What was really amazing about this experience, and one that really shaped me for all the years that followed, was that deeply ingrained in everything we did was the notion of human dignity. In everything we did, whether it was the chats in our bunks, on the sports fields, in the lake, was this respect for everyone's innate human dignity. And what is amazing is that when you build a community, a society that is deeply rooted in our shared humanity, you can solve some really hard problems. I was so inspired by this that after I graduated college, I moved to the Middle East. I moved to Jerusalem, and I helped open up the Regional Center for Coexistence. One of my campers was a 17-year-old Palestinian-Israeli kid named Asil Asleh. Asil was the kind of kid who wanted to fix the world and had the capability to do it. He would quote Rumi and Sufi poetry right next to Tupac at the same time. It's beautiful. About a year after I moved to Jerusalem, one thing to know, how many of you guys are under 35? How many of you over 35? Yeah, what's up? Now, I feel like I have to say this when I talk about this now, because for everyone under 35, this might be hard to believe, but there was a moment in the late 90s when there was a genuine possibility of Israeli-Palestinian peace. I mean, what we used to do, we would bring Israelis into Palestinian homes, Palestinians into Israeli schools. I ate more meals than I knew what to do with, celebrated every holiday, Christian, Muslim, Jewish. But about a year after I moved out there, the peace process fell apart, and daily fighting became our norm. And Asil Asleh was murdered by an Israeli police officer. He was at a protest, protesting what was happening, and a police officer, for some reason that's still not entirely known to this day, targeted Asil, ran him down into an olive grove, shot him in the back of the neck at close range, and left him for dead. He died on his way to the hospital. There was a commission that took place after Asil's death to look into whether or not there was a justification for his death. That commission found his shooting unjustified, and yet no person was ever held accountable for his death. In the weeks and months that followed, the situation deteriorated even worse, and it became clear that the programs that we were running, bringing people across borders, was no longer possible. So I did what many college graduates without a very clear direction do. I went to law school. I came here to GW and decided to start my legal career. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do, but I knew it had something to do with understanding about the rule of law. You see, I believed that rule of law and order had some component to whether or not we could build stable and secure communities. If you asked me what I wanted to be, I couldn't have told you what I wanted to be, but I would have told you I didn't want to be a real lawyer, and I certainly did not want to be a prosecutor. I wanted to go into those legal systems and try to rebuild it. By the time I got to graduation, I had a little bit of a better idea what I wanted to do. I wanted to go work at the U.S. Department of State as a program officer. But if you asked me who I wanted to be, I might have told you I wanted to be the kind of person who fixed broken places. Now, one aside, because I think this is important, I got to graduation. I'm sitting in, what's the sports stadium, basketball court. Anyone? Where they play basketball here? The big one. Where you graduate? Thank you, the Smith Center. So I'm in there. There's like 30,000 people watching our graduation, and I did not have a job yet, right? This was like, the market was pretty good in those days too, so that was like particularly not a good thing to be sitting at graduation without a job. Now, I had an interview lined up for the job that was my dream job at the U.S. Department of State as a program officer. So I'm sitting at graduation, and we're all sitting alphabetically, as they do, and the person to my right is Erica Fishman, no relation. But Erica Fishman and I knew each other, and liked each other. You know, it turns out when you're the only two Fishmans in a graduating class, there's some degree of camaraderie. And I'm telling her about this upcoming interview that I have at the State Department. And she says, my best friend works in that office. I had that interview the next week. I got the job. Thank you, Erica Fishman. So I want one lesson to be that while you are in law school, you should find every person who has the same last name as you, befriend them, because you don't know when that will become useful. But maybe even more broadly, this idea that when we have our hopes and dreams, we should throw them out into the world. You'll be surprised who can help you along the way. So I got that job at the U.S. State Department. One of the first things they did was send me to Kosovo. Yeah, it was nuts. I think you're like, why are they handing me a Kalashnikov? I don't know. But I spent my days, one thing you should know about Kosovo, this is 2004. It's about 5 years after the war in Kosovo had ended. And at the time, the provisional government of Kosovo was run by the UN. There was a UN police force. There was still UN military there. The State Department had a rather large contingent. And my job was to manage US programs involving police, prosecutors, and the courts. So one day I'm driving through a frozen Kosovo countryside with my colleague, Marcus Funk. Marcus was an AUSA from Chicago. He had spent his career investigating the mob and abusive priests. And I was telling him about my future dreams of using my legal career to fix broken legal systems. So Marcus looks at me. He says, kid. Okay, he didn't say that, but I always like the story a little bit better when he says that. But he says, kid, you're a smart kid. You went to GW Law School. You had a great legal education. You have a lot of ideas about how to make the world a better place. But he says, you haven't done anything yet. And if you're going to have any chance at being successful, you got to go do something. You got to go be in the system first. Marcus told me I should be a prosecutor. Marcus, I understand your point about needing to be in the system, but I cannot be a prosecutor. I care too much about civil rights. I'm going to go be a defense attorney. And Marcus looked at me, shook his head, said, kid. He said, if you care about civil rights, then you have to be a prosecutor, because they're the ones with all the power. Now, that was an incredibly novel idea back then, but I was convinced enough to try it out. Now, I was fortunately to have been hired into the State Department as a part of the Presidential Management Fellowship. Rest in peace. Sorry that one's not around for you guys. Hopefully it will come back soon. The Presidential Management Fellowship allowed me to rotate to different parts of the U.S. government. So I went over to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where I handled domestic violence cases, sexual assault cases, and I got to be a real prosecutor. All right, now you guys have been taking criminal law with one of the best professors in America. So I want to start off by asking this question. What is the role of the prosecutor? Gunner, my gunner friend, front row.
To prosecute people.
All right.
To decide the charges and create a case against the people that you are charging and follow through with that, or create plea deals, etc.
Anyone else want to add to the definition? I mean, I don't know if anyone's still watching Law and Order, but in the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate but equally important groups. The police who investigate the crimes and the prosecutors who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Thump, thump. Right. I mean, the job is to prosecute the offenders. And I was like, now I'm in the situation where that's my job, to go prosecute the offenders. And I show up In DC Superior Court, I've got a caseload of hundreds of cases, and much to my surprise, I was actually quite good at the job, and even enjoyed it on many days. But what I saw inside DC's Superior Court is nothing like what they used to show us on Law and Order. I saw a lot of poverty. I saw a lot of people suffering from mental health challenges. I saw a lot of people suffering from substance abuse challenges. I saw a lot of unresolved trauma. I saw a lot of injustice. And yet, I felt there was something to what Marcus had said. There was something about the power of this position that we could somehow use it to build better systems, to make a difference in our community. And around that time, I figured out, well, what kind of cases do I want to prosecute? And if you asked me what I wanted to be, I would have told you I wanted to be a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, criminal section. If you asked me who I wanted to be, I wanted to be someone who battled injustice. Which brings me back to that thin brown folder on my desk. At the time, I was a rookie, just a few years out of law school, and our responsibility was to try to figure out whether or not those allegations that the police had killed Henry Glover, burned his body to cover up the crime, whether or not that was true. As I mentioned before, I teamed up with FBI agent Ashley Johnson, hit the ground running, tried to figure it out. This is what we learned. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in August of 2005. A lot of people think of it as a natural disaster, but I think that's the wrong way to think about Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was a human disaster of epic proportions. When the hurricane hit New Orleans, it breached levees that protect the city, which sits below seawater, and 80% of the city became flooded. Algiers was a part of the 20% of the city that stayed dry. Now, Henry Glover and his family were among New Orleans' poorest of the poor. They had waited out the storm, and when it had passed, they thought they had actually beat the worst of it. But unbeknownst to them, the rest of the city was underwater, and services were not going to be coming back anytime soon. About 4 days after the storm, Henry and his family had decided it was time to leave. They had no way to get out of town, so Henry stole a truck. Henry stole a truck, and then he went to a nearby strip mall to pick up some items that a friend of his had taken for their evacuation. While at this strip mall, unbeknownst to Henry and his friend, up on the second floor balcony was a sharpshooter police officer named David Warren, holding his personally owned assault rifle. At some point during the incident, David Warren yelled out a command. Henry and his friend take off running. David Warren lowers his gun and fires from 66 feet away, hitting Henry in the back. Henry's friend and Henry's brother try to get Henry some help. It's 4 days after Hurricane Katrina, and there's no one around, but they managed to flag down a good Samaritan who's driving in the area, a man named William Tanner. And William Tanner picks up Henry and his friends and rushes them to get help. But again, it's Hurricane Katrina, and the nearest hospital is at least 15, 20 minutes away. And so the Good Samaritan, William Tanner, decides to go somewhere else. He drives to a nearby elementary school because he believes that that is where they are going to find medical supplies. Now, unbeknownst to Tanner or anyone else, that elementary school had been taken over by New Orleans SWAT team, also known as the Special Operations Division, that was run by a lieutenant named Dwayne Sherman. But once the men arrived at the school, they were pulled from the car, assaulted, handcuffed. Henry Glover was left in the car to die. Within 2 hours, one of the officers on the scene, Greg McCrae, followed by Dwayne Sherman, drove off with the car with Henry's body still in it and lit it on fire. For the next 3 years, all of this was covered up. By the end of our 18-month investigation, Ashley and I, with the help of a number of really great agents and prosecutors, indicted 5 police officers for killing Henry Glover, burning his body, and covering up the crime. During my closing argument, I tried to draw on some of the lessons that I had taken from the war zones that I had worked in. You know, it's really easy to destroy, but it's a lot harder to rebuild. And I argued to the jury that we had to engage in the rule of law, that in fact, in times of disaster and trouble, the rule of law is all we got. I argued the crimes happened because these police officers saw their victim as unworthy of the law's protection. The storm did not absolve them from the responsibilities enshrined in their oath to serve mankind, to protect the innocent, to respect the constitutional rights of all. Hurricane Katrina did not suspend those obligations. In fact, in times like those, the ideals mattered more than ever. Now, I'm not going to tell you what happened. If you want to know the ending, you got to buy the book. I mean, I didn't spend all this time writing a book for that reason. But now, what I do want to talk about is why I wrote the book about this story and what I think it tells us. I wrote the book because it was set in a dystopian hellscape of a community on the verge of collapse where people were asking, should we even rebuild this city? Involved one of the most notoriously corrupt police departments of all time. It includes a cast of characters so colorful that you can only find them in New Orleans. I wrote this book because what I think it shows is just how fragile our institutions are. Our government institutions, our law enforcement institutions, and it shows the great risk that we all face when we take those things too lightly. One of the things that really struck me in the prosecuting of this case, and Ashley and I interviewed over 200 people during the course of this case, and the thing that really stays with me all of these years was how many people lied to us, covered up the truth, turned and looked the other way. That is what enables injustice to flourish. But it was also a case about the people who spoke up, often at great personal risk to themselves, to their families, and who enabled us to get some accountability in that case. I also think this book is even more interesting today than when I published it 3 years ago. And kind of what surprises me is just how much has changed in those short 3 years. There is no doubt that our rule of law is under assault in ways that I have never seen in this country. There's surely going to be a point in the future when we look back and many people want to prosecute the people who are responsible for that destruction. I think the book, in many ways, talks about both what we can and cannot accomplish through those prosecutions. And one of the things that was interesting about the aftermath of this case was that the New Orleans Police Department began remaking itself in ways that had never been before possible. And today, the New Orleans Police Department is a far better police department than it was when I first showed up. Even an organization as corrupt as the New Orleans Police Department can get better. One of the other things that I thought was so striking about this case when I reread it is that the technology is so outdated. You know, one of the big moments in the book, I will tell you this one. One of the big moments takes place on a BlackBerry. Getting a picture pixelated over time. You know, now I think about the tools that are available in terms of data, the ability to use surveillance capabilities, the ability to process information at speeds that certainly were not possible when Ashley and I were doing this case. And yet, I don't know that those tools alone get us to solve this case. At the end, this was a human case. This was a case about humans going out into the world, try to understand what made people take action. What were their fears? What were their hopes? What were their dreams? What were their limitations? And if we are going to solve hard cases and do hard things, it's going to take a lot of humanity out in the field. For the next decade or so after that case, I continued to work at the Justice Department. I continued to investigate allegations of police misconduct, hate crimes, human trafficking. And in 2015, this case came across my desk. The murder of Walter Scott down in North Charleston, South Carolina. Anyone remember this case from when it came out? Damn, you guys are making me feel old. This was a huge deal back in 2015. This was one of the cases that really sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. It was one of the very first times that a killing by a police officer was captured on video in a way that was, I would say, uncontrovertible. You watch this video, the officer drawing his gun, firing 8 shots at Walter Scott as he's running away. This particular video was captured on cell phone by a local barber named Faden Santana. Faden was on his way to work, and he just got a feeling that something wasn't right. He grabs his phone, he stumbles with it, and he captures this video. And when I saw that video for the first time, I thought, wow, I've been watching police videos for my entire career. I've never seen anything this clear. Now, about 3 months after Walter Scott was killed, Charleston was on edge again when a white supremacist walked into a Mother Emanuel AME church and massacred 9 parishioners. It was a really tense time to be in Charleston, South Carolina. The state prosecutors who had the Walter Scott case went first. And notwithstanding this clear, damning evidence, wound up with a hung jury. I remember being shocked. How was it possible that a jury could be undecided about what was such a clear piece of evidence? Charleston was on edge, and I would say it was a tinderbox. If I were to give credit to any one family for keeping things going, it would be the Scott family. Walter Scott's family called for peace. They called for calm. They said, trust the process. The feds are coming. They'll get us justice. I was the feds. It's a lot of pressure. We won. And we won. The officer was found guilty. The judge found that the killing was a murder. And Michael Slager, the officer who killed Walter Scott, was given one of the longest sentences ever in the history of the United States for killing a civilian. But I will say, as I was standing on the courthouse steps in the aftermath of that case, I felt ambivalent at best. I mean, I can tell you what I wanted to feel. I wanted to feel justice. Because one thing I have learned over the course of my career, more than anything else, justice is a feeling. And you know it when you've got it. And I felt justice in a human trafficking case I did when 9 victims of a brutal sex trafficking ring walked themselves into a bank to deposit their restitution checks and finally got to start their lives over. That felt like justice. Felt justice after prosecuting 2 police officers. The only way we were able to do it was for an entire community of some of the most marginalized people to come together to speak up in the truth and finally get those officers off the street. That felt like justice. And I felt justice in a hate crime case I prosecuted when the victim of a brutal, brutal torture got to look down his attackers in the eye and say, "Your hate will not define me." That felt like justice. But as I was standing on the courthouse steps after this case, perhaps I had grown jaded after 14 years of investigating police killings, just seeing over and over again, why did this keep happening? In the course of the time that I investigated this case, the 2.5 years that we investigated the murder of Walter Scott, over 2,500 other people died in confrontations with the police. I knew that Walter Scott wasn't coming back. And I knew that the systems and structures and procedures that all contributed to Walter Scott's death in their own way, they were still going to be there the next day. When you feel this way, after what is arguably the biggest victory of your career, it is time to get a new job. But if you ask me what I wanted to be, I had no idea. I couldn't have given you an answer back then. Around the same time that I was struggling with this question about what I wanted to be, I got a call from Scarlett Wilson. She was the chief elected prosecutor in Charleston and Berkeley counties, South Carolina. When she was little, if you asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she would have told you she wanted to be a lawyer. The reason she wanted to be a lawyer was that her caretaker, the woman who helped raise her, Sister Bertha, they used to watch soap operas together. And Scarlett used to see all the lawyers, and she said, those were all the cool guys. I want to be one of them. Scarlett actually becomes a real lawyer. She becomes the elected prosecutor. And I knew her from the Walter Scott case. She had worked on it from the state. And something interesting was happening in her world at that time. She was learning about data. She was learning about structural inequalities. She also happened to be responsible for the state prosecution of Dylan Roof for the Mother Emanuel murders. And she called me up because she had been collecting all of this data on how prosecutors were making decisions about who got arrested and what happened to these people. And she says to me, I have all of this data about our decision making, and yet I cannot find anyone to help me make sense of it. She says, do you think we can use this data so that we can be more fair and effective? Again, I didn't know what I was going to be, but yeah, I was down for that. Now, of course, I didn't know anything about data, so I had to try to figure this out. Was it possible to actually help Scarlett? So I did what I imagine some of you will do when you get out of this place and you're trying to figure out who do I know who might know this. You'll send a message back to your old alma mater, George Washington University. And I said, you guys have anyone who knows anything about data? I got passed around a bunch, and eventually I wound up in the computer of Professor Don Braman. Don says, sure, let's go have coffee. We had coffee across the street at Paul. I tell him about Scarlett. I tell him about this question. I say, Don, can we use this data to make the system more fair and effective? Am I nuts? And Don said, oh, we absolutely can use this data to make the system better. So I handed in my notice at the U.S. Department of Justice. I went out and I raised some money. I got an MOU with Scarlett, and we hit the ground running. One minor setback, right around the same time, there was a global pandemic that broke out, upending all of my plans. Debated whether or not I should take such a big chunk, or whether or not I should hold on to my cushy job with healthcare. I said, screw it. I'm never going to have all of these pieces together ever again. So I became the founder and executive director of Justice Innovation Lab and began building a team of prosecutors and data scientists, human-centered design thinkers that were going to go down to Charleston and try to figure out, could we help Scarlett make her system more fair and effective? But in order to do that, first I had to learn a little bit about data. See, I had read the book Moneyball. I don't know if anyone's read the book Moneyball or at least seen the movie, but for those of you who haven't, it's a story of a mid-market baseball team who turns to data analytics to start winning baseball games. And I thought if the Oakland A's could use analytics to win baseball, then surely we could use it to make the system more fair and effective. So data is all about counting. But what I've come to learn over these years is data only works if two things are true. First, you've got to believe the numbers. You've got to trust that the data that is coming in your way reflects actual reality. And far too often in the criminal justice system, this is not true. But Scarlett had been doing a really good job and had a lot of reliable data. But it only matters if you're counting the right things. And far too often, we are counting the wrong things. So when I first learned about data, I was still at the US Department of State. I was working on post-war in Iraq at that time. And we used to meet at the Eisenhower Executive Building, and we had our metrics that we were trying to meet to determine whether or not we were bringing the rule of law to Iraq. And the metric that we used as our gold standard every time, how many courthouses had we built? How many of you think that that is remotely an indicator of whether or not we were achieving the rule of law in Iraq? I mean, of course it's not. And for so long inside the American criminal legal system, particularly as prosecutors, we've counted two things. Counted the number of people that we've convicted, and we've counted the number of years that we've sentenced them to incarceration. That pretty much is it. And while I think those things tell us something about our justice system, I think we can do a lot better. If you got a phone call from a prosecutor who said, "Here is all my data, tell me if I'm being fair and effective," what would you want to count? Feel free to raise your hand. What would you want to count to figure out if your jurisdiction was being fair? Unbridled access.
Recidivism.
Recidivism.
Any sort of standard demographic information of those who were arrested.
All right. Are we treating different people similarly, differently, based on their demographic information?
Perhaps the clearance rates to see if things are coming to a resolution.
Right. Whether or not we're solving some cases.
The number of cases that are lost on appeal.
Lost on appeal.
Demographics and information about the people on the jury.
All right. Information about your juries. Anyone else? I mean, the reality is this question is overwhelming because we could count anything. I mean, most prosecutors I know say that they do this for the victims. But when you ask victims about how our system is serving them, we get a really bad score. 6 in 10 victims of violent crime do not even report their victimization to law enforcement, which to me is a pretty good indicator that we are not serving victims, certainly not effectively. We could figure out whether or not we're solving the hardest and most important crimes, the murders, the rape, the aggravated assaults. Because when we start to count that, what we realize is we are doing a terrible job at solving the things that most citizens really care a lot about. 16 million. Anyone have an idea what this number is?
Percentage of the population incarcerated.
No, but close. This is the number of people who are arrested or cited every year and wind up inside the American criminal legal system. Sometimes in our jails, sometimes in our courts. 16 million. A lot of people. This is my favorite statistic that no one in America counts. I think every jurisdiction should be able to count this number. It is what I call years per year. If you added up all of the sentences in your jurisdiction, from the 1-day sentence to the 5-day sentence to the 30-day sentence to 5 years to 50 years, and you added them all up, that number would be your years per year. How much incarceration are you sentencing your population to every year? Now, I only know one jurisdiction that's ever tried to measure this. It was a small jurisdiction, population, roughly 600,000 people, and they were incarcerating people at 4,000 years per year. One city, not the state, one city. Right, from a human perspective, this number is pretty overwhelming. It tells us the whole scope of the loss of humanity. But it also matters because incarceration is one of the most expensive tools we have in our arsenal. In that particular jurisdiction, it's $40,000 a year for every year. Times 4,000 years, that is a future commitment of $160 million of incarceration per year. Right, next year, if you do the same thing, that's another $160 million. And the next year, the same thing. That was a state where it didn't cost that much to incarcerate people. As I've gotten to know a little bit more about data, if you believe that there is a time and place to incarcerate people because we need to incapacitate dangerous people, at least sometimes, there's probably some optimal number, right? There's got to be some optimal number of how many years do we need to sentence people to in order to achieve it. Because if we are sentencing people to more than is necessary, then we are not only destroying communities, but we're spending a lot of money doing it. One of the things when we first showed that 4,000 number to the jurisdiction was they assumed, as I think many people assume when I talk about this, is that, well, yeah, man, you got the murderers. That's like 75 years. The rapists there got 50 years. Like, you get to 4,000 years pretty quick. But when we started looking at their numbers, we actually found something a little bit different. We had asked them to rank all of the kinds of charges that they saw in their office and to prioritize them based on what was most important to them. And when they ranked it, it came out pretty much what I think it would look like in most jurisdictions. Put murder at the top, sexual assault was not far behind it, armed carjacking, things like shoplifting and possession of small amounts of drugs at the bottom, right? Like, that was their priorities as an office. But when they started to look at what was happening to the people they prosecuted, you see things like possession, small amounts, costing them $3 to $6 million, 200 years of incarceration every year. Right? These are what happened when you add up hundreds of 10 days, hundreds of 5 days. And they weren't thinking about it like this. And quickly they realized that some of our strategy is inconsistent with our purpose, with our values, with what we hope to achieve. And one of the other things that happened when we started looking through the data was they found this. 1 in 4 of their cases were being dismissed for insufficient evidence. 1 in 4. It's a lot of resources being spent at the policing level, at the prosecution level, for a case that the prosecutors didn't think should be there. Right? This is their decision. 1 in 4. But not only was that a colossal waste of their resources, it was taking them, on average, 220 days to make that decision. 220 days. And so during that time, a lot of those people are sitting in jail. All of them have a huge albatross hanging over their head. They all had to pay bonds that they're not getting back. 220 days. And we also looked at the demographic difference between white defendants and black defendants. And what we found was even when we controlled for everything that the prosecutor said should make a difference, black defendants, it's taking 40 days longer on average to have their cases dismissed for insufficient evidence. Now, when this number first came out and people were thinking about what to do with it, the natural inclination was to say, they're racist. Of course they're racist. The numbers are 40 days longer. But it actually required that office to say, are we racist? Is this who we are? It certainly isn't who we want to be. This is not how we define fairness. So they decided they were going to try to tackle that problem. But how do you tackle a problem as large as this? Well, we turned to a field that, as far as I know, isn't typically brought into the criminal justice space, called human-centered design or design thinking. Anyone familiar with human-centered design thinking? No? Still hasn't really made it to law school? Don and I teach a class, fall semesters. It's called Jill at GW. We talk a lot about human-centered design, systems thinking, and metrics. Sign up for it in the fall. All right. Fall, right? Spring. Sorry. Next spring. what is design thinking? So design thinking has been used in all sorts of fields to try to solve really hard problems. Everything from architecture to medicine to your favorite app was likely designed with human-centered design. And the key to human-centered design is, not surprisingly, it centers on the humans, right? The people who are actually coming into contact with the system. And the key idea behind all of this is that we need to bring empathy and humanity to the people at the center of this problem. And sometimes people break it into 5 phases or 3 phases. For the purpose of this class, I'll keep it to 3. Don and I are still working out the semantics. But the first phase is to understand and define, right? To understand what problem you are trying to solve and to define it clearly. Most of the time when I work in jurisdictions, they're not even sure what problem they are trying to solve. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand it. You can do it by things like running analytics on their metrics. You can do things like systems thinking, which I'll talk about in a little bit, because our goal is to really understand the problem. And once we have a good sense of what that problem is, we imagine, right? We ideate. We think about all of the possible ways that we can solve this problem. This is a very expansive thinking where you want to get as many ideas as you can on the table. And then you pick the ones that you can test and you get to work. Now, a lot of the places we work with, we say, all right, once you have ideated, here is the restriction. You have to make a difference in the next 6 months. You are not allowed to change any laws, and you are not allowed to get any new resources. Go. And initially, it's scary for people, because when we ideate, we're always talking about our hopes and dreams, and everyone, especially the lawyers, we're always changing the laws. It's like the first thing. What do we do? Let's change the laws. Can't change the laws. You're not allowed to do it. And then we prototype. Right? We come up with a small solution that we can test to see whether or not our idea was any good. And most of the time in policy, we are not doing this. We are just passing really big laws that have huge implications for millions and millions of people. And then we tell ourselves that it worked. Right? That's not how you make good policy. So we prototype, we test, we iterate. This is not a linear process, because sometimes you get to here and realize, actually, there's more to the problem. We need to go back and understand and define a little bit more clearly. And then we're probably going to need to ideate a little bit more. And then we're going to prototype some more. So that is how we approach this problem. And a big part of what I think was helpful was systems thinking. I like systems thinking is because it gave us all sorts of new vocabulary to use in talking about the criminal justice system that ratcheted down the tension that so often accompanies conversations about justice reform in America. So I want to ask you guys a question, because when I travel around the country, I hear this a lot. I hear it from police officers and prosecutors, defense attorneys, victims, community members. They tell me the criminal justice system is broken. So can I get a show of hands? How many of you agree with this statement? The criminal justice system is broken. Raise your hands. How many of you disagree with this statement and believe that the criminal justice system is working exactly the way it's supposed to work? All right. I think the division on this question can be explained partly by what actually is a system. All right. And I think if we have a shared language around the system, we might actually get a little bit more commonality as to the answer. What is a system? System is an interconnected set of elements organized to achieve a purpose. All right, can someone, other than the criminal justice system, we'll save that one for later, can someone shout out the name of another system that meets this definition?
The military-industrial complex.
No, that's a system for sure.
Healthcare.
Healthcare is a system. Keep going.
The education system.
Education system. Let's go. Start shouting them out. I mean, this is such a broad definition. Basically, anything you shout out will likely fit this definition. Your study group is a system. Right? Your moot court team is a system. right? They're interconnected sets of elements, sometimes people, that are organized to achieve a purpose. And so let's go back to the criminal justice system. What is the purpose of our criminal justice system?
This might be controversial, but the reason why I raised my hand and said it's working exactly as intended is because I think at least part of the system's intended to oppress people, and that's what's happening.
All right. Part of its purpose is to oppress people. Who has another idea what the purpose of the justice system is?
Punish crime.
Punish.
To, enact or actualize law and order.
Create law and order, create stability.
Similarly to deter crime.
Deter crime. All right, this is like back to the first week of class. Deterrence, incapacitation.
Protect capital and property.
Protect capital and property. Right? So, part of the question of whether or not our system is working is what do you think its purpose is? Because if you think its purpose is to oppress and you look at what's happening and you say, we're doing a really good job at oppressing people, then yeah, the system's working. If you think the purpose of the system is to create law and order, if you think the system is to get victims restitution, a lot of times we're failing pretty miserably. There is a statement, and I don't credit anyone for these. These are a lot of people say this. I would say I learned it from Donnell Mello. I learned it from Peter Singe, David Stroh, a lot of people. Kind of mixed up a lot of words to get to definition. I think is a little bit better. But systems are perfectly designed to achieve the results they're currently achieving. So if we're looking at outcomes in a community, we don't like them because they're oppressing people or we're getting unequal effects based on a particular part of the community. I guess the first thing to say is, well, that's just the system working the way it's currently built. Right? It's perfectly designed to achieve that result. But systems are not the sum of its parts. It's the product of their interactions. And so to take this to the highest level, what is systems thinking? Systems thinking is about understanding the interactions between different parts of a system to achieve the desired outcomes. And so if we are thoughtful about what we want to happen at the end of our process, if we want it to reduce recidivism, right? If part of our goal is that once you come into our system, you get better in a way that you never come back, all right, well, then we need to think about the interactions that are currently making so that we have some of the worst recidivism rates in the world. I'm going to tell you how we use this concept to help people radically rethink what was happening in their jurisdiction. Show of hands, how many of you have ever taken a bath? You get personal. All right, very good. So, how many of you have taken a bath in an old-timey bath? Because those are the best baths. All right. Well, we know how it works, right? If you're trying to have the perfect bath, you got to control your inputs, the hot water and the cold water, right? You want to get the temperature just right. Then the water starts to rise. You want to get it to that right level. If we get too much, we can get rid of it by opening up the drain. Create that system balance so that we get the perfect bath. Now, what does that have to do with the criminal justice system? Thank you for asking and thank you for staying with me. What if we think about the caseloads of our criminal justice systems like a bath, right? We get inputs coming into our system. The police bring us cases. Sometimes they bring us good cases, and sometimes they bring us bad cases. They load up that tub, and we got to get rid of them somehow. We get rid of them through dismissals, through remands, through pleas, through trials, through diversions. Well, what was happening in Charleston, South Carolina, and most jurisdictions in America when we showed up? Every month, more cases were coming into the system than were leaving the system. And if we were going to take the bathtub analogy to its full end, right, they were overflowing with more cases coming in. And I can promise you, it was not that cute. It was not that cute at all. It was actually pretty terrible. They had more cases coming in, and that was impacting everything because now they couldn't handle the murders and rapes and aggravated assaults that they all really wanted to be working on, because they were overwhelmed with the possession cases, with the shopliftings, with the disorderlies. So a big part of what we try to bring to this was take a hypothesis mindset. For those of you who haven't taken science in a really long time, it's probably a lot of you because that's how you wound up in law school. A hypothesis is an idea that can be tested. And what I like about this is, when people talk about what's wrong with the justice system, they'll just tell you what's wrong. And they might be right, they might be wrong. They're usually very strongly willed about it. But when you shift your thinking to, all right, your idea is actually just a hypothesis, and we should test it. So, for example, when we were trying to understand that difference between how long it was taking to get rid of a case, to dismiss those cases, one of the hypotheses that the prosecutors came with is, I bet you this is being driven by cases with multiple defense attorney assignments, that people are being assigned. Or maybe there's a difference between people who are getting public counsel or private counsel. All totally reasonable hypotheses based on what they were looking at. Turns out neither of those things made a difference. But we could test it because we had the numbers. Well, we started to figure out, all right, well, using the system of thinking approach, like what could we do to reduce the backlog, to reduce the overwhelming overload of cases that we're finding? And they said, I know one thing we could do. Let's turn off the bad cases, right? Seems like a good starting point. Let's try to turn off the lever of bad cases. Let's try to figure out who should be diverted. Let's try to divert those people faster. Cases that shouldn't be in our system actually should be in a lower court. Let's remand them faster. And if we do that, our hypothesis is that will reduce our caseload, maybe even help us address some of those racial disparities that we saw. And so what did they do? This, I will tell you, is probably one of the most boring yet impactful things that I have ever done in my career, which was, said, hey, why don't we put a screening attorney earlier in the process? It's going to be that guy's job to turn off the bad cases. It's like really all his job is going to be. His name's Bruce. Bruce was a curmudgeon-y old prosecutor, 25-year homicide prosecutor. I actually knew him working on the Walter Scott case. Put him up. And the thing was, Bruce knew what he was looking for because he knew what the murders, he knew what was supposed to be in the system. And he saw this, and he's like, bad case, no evidence. Boom, dismiss. This case should never even been here. Boom, dismiss. And quite quickly, what we saw was we were reducing the population. So when you have a hypothesis and then you begin to see the impact of your hypothesis, you know what happens? People want to do more of it because they're like, wow, I just did something totally obvious and it had this huge impact. So we then expanded that screening process, but still we didn't have capacity to screen every case they wanted to do. We could only screen about half of them, which is great if you're a scientist because you can set up a little experiment. Half the cases got treated just the way they always did through the regular process. Half the cases went to the new process, and it was random, essentially based on what time you got arrested. You went to one or the other. And what did we find out? They reversed the trend in what was happening. They were getting rid of more cases. They were dismissing cases. They were remanding cases. They were diverting cases. 4 times more cases they were able to resolve in 3 months. 150 days faster to dismiss a case for insufficient evidence. Substantially reduce the number of people sitting in jail unnecessarily. We added them up. It was about 3,000 days during the course of this experiment. It's a lot more now. And that disparity between how black and white defendants were being treated, eliminated within the margin of error. And what happened in terms of recidivism? Numbers are at least showing that when you get people out of the system faster, they're less likely to come back. They shouldn't be there in the first place. Still within the margin of error. Not statistically significant if you care about those things, but That's only because of the number of people who have gone through so far. I have no doubt that this is going to hold as those numbers get bigger and bigger. And for those of you who care about taxpayer dollars, this is a super conservative number. We helped save that jurisdiction $400,000 just by ensuring that people who didn't need to be in jail weren't in there. Fewer court hearings. No unnecessary defense attorney appointments. South Carolina's leading paper said that we provide a common sense, we can't believe this isn't being done program, which I actually like that headline better than Monumental Day for Civil Rights. Same newspaper, though. Right? But why doesn't it happen? Nothing I told you is rocket science. The status quo is a beast. Inertia is a very, very worthy adversary. And so we take steps, one at a time, to try to prove a way forward. Now, in the years since we did this, we've expanded beyond Charleston. We're now working in 18 different jurisdictions around America. We started a program called the Justice Innovation Accelerator, where every year, somewhere between 6 and 10 jurisdictions bring us a problem. They compete to be a part of it. We run them through our process with the goal of, can you find a solution in 12 months without changing any laws, without getting any new resources? How do you start to solve those problems? We're excited we got another cohort coming in October. The most important thing, and I would even say the most radical thing that we do at Justice Innovation Lab, is we meet people where they're at. You know, Scarlett and I are a bit of an odd couple. Scarlett is a Republican elected law and order DA, and I was her lefty civil rights friend from Washington. I think when we started that, we certainly had a lot of assumptions about each other, our motives, and where we were going. But through this process of meeting each other where they were at, hearing each other out, testing each other's hypotheses, holding each other accountable, we were able to make some of the most profound changes inside a criminal justice system in the last year. And we did it without anyone yelling at each other. We did it without people trying to blow it up. Like, we did it by bringing together people who recognized that we need to solve some really hard problems. Who is wise? The person who learns from all people. Or one of Asil's favorite quotes from Rumi, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. I think this is what we need to do if we are going to save our country, is we have got to find that field where we can sit down, where we can talk about what is happening, where we can truly understand it, where we can imagine something different, and then we can go do something about it. So, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, we got some really exciting projects. We got another accelerator going on. We had 6 teams that came last year that's doing some really interesting things, including an amazing project in Boston that's looking to divert more and more cases out of the system into mental health treatment and community service treatment. You can follow us in these places. If you want to know what happens at the end of the book, buy it. It's on sale now for Amazon. They also have some at the library, at the bookstore. But before I kind of take some questions, because I want to have an opportunity to take some questions, I did say my talk was about building a purpose-driven career. So here are some of the lessons I think that you guys can take. It really starts by figuring out, who do you want to be? Who do you want to be when you grow up? Make sure you're counting the right things. You know, it's all too easy when we're thinking about our jobs to count the thing that is easiest to count, which are dollars. Very easy to count those things. Might not be the metric that you want to judge your life by. For those of you who wind up working in corporate law and you wind up counting the worst thing to measure in the legal system, the billable hour. Whew. Count the right things. Figure out what metric you want to define your life by, because it's way easier to get there when you know what you're counting the right things. Take a hypothesis mindset. Treat your ideas as if they're just hypotheses, and then go test them. Sometimes you will figure out you are right. Sometimes you will figure out you're wrong. And most of the time you will figure like, you're sort of right. Learn from all people. There's a lot of interesting ideas and people out there in the world. You know, when I was in law school, I used to think I had a very diverse set of friends. I knew black people and white people. I knew people from all sorts of different countries. Muslims, Christians, Jews, even knew a Zoroastrian. Felt very diverse. But most of the people I knew in DC were lawyers and international development people, and they were all middle class. It's only with time that I began to realize, like, that's one form of diversity. But now I have friends who are farmers and bakers and librarians and economists and venture capitalists. And I can tell you, each of them think about the world a little bit differently. And when we begin to understand the way other people see the world, our world becomes bigger. And we have a greater understanding of our place in it. And invest in relationships. Einstein is quoted as saying that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. Apparently he didn't actually say that, but the idea is still sound. Compound interest, very valuable idea. Relationships are like compound interest. They only get more powerful over time. When I started Justice Innovation Lab and I needed to put together a board, I needed people who understood governance of nonprofits. I needed people who could help me figure out where the money was coming from. I needed people who had their hands in jurisdictions all over the place. I leaned on my relationships. Not relationships that I made last week. Some of those were relationships I made 30 years ago. Those relationships will gain power over time. So before I close out and ask some questions, I have this thing that I've really been wanting to try. And so you guys are going to help me out tonight. All right. Has anyone seen the movie Spartacus? No? If you've seen, like, raise your hand if you've seen the movie Spartacus. All right. When you guys go home, you're going to have to YouTube it. So I'll give you a little bit description. So Spartacus is one of those Roman tales, and there's a point. Spartacus is the leader of the revolt, and they get busted. But no one knows who Spartacus is. So in like the big scene at the end of the movie, they're coming there because they want to arrest Spartacus, and they say, "Who is Spartacus?" And the first guy stands up, and Spartacus is like, "I am Spartacus." But then the next guy steps up and he says, "I am Spartacus." And then the next guy, "I am Spartacus." And before you know, everyone's standing up yelling, "I am Spartacus." All right. It's my vision. So, we're going to start with, when I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who. All right, so think about who you want to be when you grow up. And I'll start when someone's ready, I'll call on you. And then when the next hand's ready, I'll call on you. And then let's get the hands. And then before we know it, everyone's going to be standing up. You're going to be yelling this out. It's going to be my I am Spartacus moment. You guys ready? You're feeling it. All right. Who's got one?
To inspire people.
Gotta say the whole sentence.
When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who inspires people.
You gotta stand up.
When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who solves problems.
When I grow up, I want to. Oh, I thought I was interrupting someone. But when I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who fights for justice.
All right, let's go. I need more hands. I'm not getting my I am Spartacus moment. Man, there we go.
When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who is an innovative thinker.
All right.
When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who is empathetic.
When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who helps the environment.
When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who's curious.
Everyone who was too embarrassed to stand up on their own, stand up and we're going to all say it at the same time. Now you're muffled out by the crowd. When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who... All right. If you're not sure who you want to be, think about it. This is going to be helpful for you. But I got some time to take some questions. Anyone have... Wait, by the way, that didn't quite work out how in my head. Go watch I Am Spartacus tonight, and then you'll get a better idea what I was going for.
So the question I have is, I understand why, when you're kind of approaching the criminal justice system from a scientific perspective, you kind of have to have a control group to see if the proposed reform is statistically significant. But my question is, do you think that there might be some ethical problems with that because the people in the control group are not receiving the potentially valuable reform, but you also don't even know if it's valuable unless you have a control group? It seems like a paradox to me.
Yeah, I mean, so we run through things called an IRB process, which is designed to really weigh out the ethics of this. There certainly could be places where there are ethical challenge to it. That's part of why it is randomized. In this particular case, it's either you're getting the new thing or you're getting the thing that we always do anyways. So it was an easier trade-off to make. There are a lot of interventions that we cannot and should not run as randomized control trials. But there's also lots of other ways to test an intervention rigorously. So I am not an expert in all the various different ways that we do it, but a lot of times what happens is there's a policy that's implemented and it gets rolled out slowly over time, right? Because you can't just go from 0 to 100 most of the time when you're rolling out a process. So the question is, can you set it up in a way that can be tested rigorously? And where we think it can be, we think we should test it to make sure that it's working the way we thought.
Thank you for coming in here today. We really appreciate it. My question is about, you mentioned in the Walters case that sort of towards the end, once you won, you got, maybe you didn't feel like it felt like real justice. And so I want to kind of touch on that a little bit with the Justice Innovation Lab. When you're working with a jurisdiction that is improving on implementing some of this, the changes, do you still feel that you're making that new impact in this new area when a jurisdiction comes to realize that the changes that they're making has an impact and may reform their criminal justice system?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways, right? Like, a lot of us are moved by the individual story, and I think that's also one of the reasons why it's so hard to reform a system, because when you're looking at an individual case, you can almost always justify anything that happens, right? That's one of the problems. Sort of when you're looking at 50,000 feet, you get a different perspective. And some of our days are really dry. I'm looking at numbers. I'm looking at a number, and you're like, man, am I going to feel good about that? But then, the other day, I was like, how many people have we gotten through the system faster since we started this? And the message I got back was 7,000 people. 7,000 people got out of the system faster because of the work that we did. I could have never have done that as a defense attorney, as a prosecutor. And so what I think is kind of exciting is every time I get, I don't get the numbers updated all the time, but every once in a while I get, it keeps building. And for me, that momentum, that feels like justice.
I'm just curious, how has Justice Innovation Lab used AI for your data? Do you think it's helping you get more data, or do you think it raises problems of it's only like maybe you have too many metrics to look at now?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI often gets put in this blob, like AI, and it kind of depends on what you're using it for and how you're using it. So we are not using AI to replace human decision making. It's not there, and you shouldn't be doing it with criminal justice data because so much of the data in the criminal justice system is terrible. It's terrible. We're working in Boston. They cannot measure basic things about what is happening in Boston, right? And this is true all over the place. They cannot measure basic things. So if we start training AI models on some of our existing data, number one, it's just going to be faulty because so much of it is missing. And number two, it's going to reflect many historic biases in how we practiced. So I think we have to be incredibly careful in when and how we use it. That being said, there's all sorts of other ways that AI has been incredibly empowering. I mean, right now I'm working on a project where we are building new technology to help Boston divert what will be thousands of cases out of their system, right? Thousands. Would have been impossible to do this just procedurally and changing process. They actually need technology to inform different people at different stages and pass that information on. 2 years ago, it would have been prohibitively expensive to build this technology. Now we are iterating every day because we can create the technology, show it to the people. Does this work for your problem? Sort of works for my problem, but if you do this, I get them a new copy the next day, right? That is amazing. Like, it is amazing to see the speed with which we can kind of build the technology that is necessary to solve some of these problems that no one's been able to solve for forever. One of the other things that we do is we interview a lot of people. We send people out, go talk to as many different people. Have an empathetic interview, record that. And then we can distill all of that information a lot faster to figure out, all right, well, what concerns are people raising? What opportunities are people seeing? And it becomes a lot easier for us to talk to a lot more people, digest that information, and then implement it faster. So I think there is a lot of opportunity. There's a lot that I'm afraid about, and we should do it with humility, right? I think a big part of what I have learned working with Scarlett is we should be humble about this because we could get it wrong, and there's a lot of people's lives on the line. So we owe it to be as rigorous as possible.